Dr. Sleeter, you've been here in South Dakota and you've talked to us about the changing demographics both here in the state and nationally. So could you talk to us more about what the field of education needs to do to keep up with the changing population, and how do we continue to create an equitable opportunity for all students to succeed?
Well, let me start with the last part of your question of continue to create an equitable opportunity, because I don't think we've done that yet.
Sure.
And when you look back over how students have scored on tests like the National Assessment for Education Progress, which has been given since 1971, it documents where there have been gaps in achievement, although it also documents considerable work toward closing those gaps in the 1970s and early 1980s. Yes. So I think it's a matter of both figuring out how to make education more equitable, as well as how to do that work on the scale that needs to be done with the changing demographics. Since my work is specifically in teacher education, that's the piece that I can talk about, but recognizing that there are other aspects of education, like how schools are financed, who has access to the most well-funded public schools and who doesn't. But I'm not going to talk about that because that's not what I do, but it's important. One of the things that I think is very important is that we work harder as a profession than we have been doing on diversifying who the teachers are. And it's not, sometimes people ask me, well, does that mean that like only African American teachers can teach African American students? No. Does that mean that anybody, just because they're a person of color, that means they're going to be a good teacher? No. But it does mean that the teaching population needs to much better reflect the student population. I know in South Dakota, just from hearing people talk and looking at some of the data, that the student populations are becoming rapidly much more diverse, particularly in certain areas of South Dakota. Nationally, what a lot of people don't realize is that students of color are now in the majority in public schools at about 51%. But the teaching population is still somewhere around 84, 82% white. Right. And that creates problems on a number of fronts. In my own work and some of my research, where I've looked at the immense efforts that many teacher educators expend trying to prepare white teachers for diverse student populations, which I think is very important work. That work doesn't need to stop. But at the same time, without trying to diversify who the teachers are, it's like we're working on one leg of the issue without working on both legs of the issue.
Right. So, and as we think about that, and I know you kind of know my work on ethnic matching and talking about how these teachers of same race can impact students of the same race. But I do agree with you that we need to think about both of these issues. What would you say to white teachers or white candidates and teachers of color or teacher candidates about, what would you say to them on how to best engage students of color?
Well, one of the first things is you really have to want to get to know your students. You can't just stand and deliver material. You need to get to know your students on a personal level, as well as learn how to use what you're learning about your students as a ways of getting their input on what will work with them in the classroom. And kids will tell you when they think that you're listening and they think that what they say matters and that you care about what they say. So so building relationships, I think, is the fundamental thing that teachers need to be able to do. And if a teacher can't build a relationship with their students of color, or their white students actually, but I think particularly with their students of color, because so many students aren't sure whether or not they can trust what happens in schools, then things will fall apart. Even if the teacher has really good lesson plans and some really good other things, if the relationships aren't there, it tends to all go sideways. But a second thing that I think is important for teachers to do is to be willing to engage in a process of learning. And part of that is curriculum content learning. I have talked here a little bit about the exciting work that's happening in ethnic studies in California and some other states, because both the research documents as well as the experiences of many teachers who have worked with either ethnic studies or an ethnically rich curriculum, that it matters to kids if they're studying material that they can relate to and that relates to their communities and where they're from, and that they can see how what they're learning in school will help them be able to address problems in their communities. And since all of us have gone through, or at least most of us have gone through, white dominant education, we go into teaching with a lot of things that we don't know. So being willing to engage in doing outside reading, going into spaces that you might not have gone into. Like teachers who may be kind of scared of hip hop, go there anyway. You don't have to become a hip hop artist yourself, but at least learn, because it's very important to kids. And being willing to engage in that kind of learning and is I think very, very important. And kids appreciate it. Even if you're not an expert, they appreciate that you're interested and you're trying.
Right, and I think you're right, because we do ask students to do that. Even students from indigenous populations, we ask them to come into the schools and learn what Thanksgiving is and what that culture is about, or what Christmas is about, rather than really allowing them to bring in their culture. And oftentimes we do that, so why not do it in reverse and say, okay, let me learn about your culture and what goes on with what happens with you. So, well, hey, thank you very, very much for coming and visiting us. We've had a great time. You've done a great job of helping us really get a step closer to really thinking about how we work with our students of color, and we appreciate your time. Thank you.
Well, I'll just say that I appreciate the responsiveness of the people who I've worked with since I've been here. I obviously can't make blanket judgments about your faculty or anything, but it's been, I think, a really warm environment where people have gotten engaged with the issues, and I like that.
All right, thank you very much.